The fellowship hall of Mount Pisgah smelled of coffee and floor wax and the paper of old hymnals, and for 40 years Cornelia Braxton had known every crack in its plaster ceiling by heart. Tonight the room was full of people who had never set foot in it before, reporters with recorders. A young man with a camera balanced on his shoulder. Two associates in gray suits standing near the door, as if they were guarding an exit no one intended to use. And at the front, behind a folding table someone had draped in a white cloth, stood Warren Kessler in a Navy Italian suit that cost more than this church collected in a year, smiling the smile of a man who has already won and only wants an audience for the winning. He held a single sheet of paper between two fingers. He held it the way you hold something you find slightly distasteful. "Mrs. Braxton," he said, and his voice was warm, and that was the cruelest part of it. "The Kessler Vantage Foundation is proud to do the right thing by this community. We know how much this little building has meant to you people over the years." He let the phrase sit there. You people. So rather than see it condemned and cleared, we're transferring the deed to the chapel back to you. Personally, for the outstanding tax balance, $186. Somebody near the coffee urn laughed. It was not a large laugh. It did not need to be. Cornelia Braxton was 74 years old. She wore a cardigan the color of a rained-on sparrow, the elbows worn to a shine, a man's cardigan too big in the shoulders. She rose from the metal folding chair the way older knees make you rise, one hand on the seat back, and she crossed the floor she had swept 10,000 times, and she took the paper from Warren Kessler's fingers. "Thank you," she said. That was all. She folded the deed once, and then again, and slid it into the pocket of the cardigan, next to a peppermint and a church bulletin from a Sunday 2 weeks gone. Then she went back to her chair and sat down and folded her hands in her lap, and she looked at Warren Kessler with an expression that was not anger, and was not sorrow, and was not anything he had a name for. And that unsettled him for reasons he could not have explained. So he looked away first. The whole room had laughed. She had not now. "I want you to hold that picture a moment, because you are going to need it later." A billionaire developer, a man whose name was carved into the sides of towers in 3 cities, handing an old widow a building he had already decided was garbage, for the price of a decent pair of shoes, in front of cameras, so the story would say he was generous, and an old woman in her dead husband's sweater, saying thank you, and meaning something by it that he could not hear. Here is the question I want you to carry with you. How does a dead church, bought for $186, bury an empire worth $380 million? Because that is exactly what happened. And the answer was sitting under that building the entire time. Warren Kessler had walked across it a dozen times. He had never once thought to ask what was underneath his own feet. She had. She had known for 40 years. And she had kept a tin box to prove it. To understand the box, you have to go back, not 2 weeks. Not 2 years. All the way back to 1888, to a Virginia that had only stopped being one thing and had not yet decided what it would become. Mount Pisgah Missionary Baptist Church was built in the spring of that year by 14 families, who had, most of them, been born the property of other men. They were free now, in the legal sense of the word, which in the Commonwealth of Virginia in 1888 was a thin and shivering kind of free. They pooled what they had. Not much. A man named Amos Pinner put in the wages from a winter of hauling cotton bales on the river. A washerwoman named Delia Rooks put in coins she had knotted into the corner of a headscarf for 11 years. They bought a narrow lot on the back edge of Jackson Ward, a lot nobody with money wanted because it flooded, and they raised a brick chapel on it with their own hands, firing some of the brick themselves in a kiln behind the lot. And they did something else on that land, something that mattered more than the building. Though it would take 130 years for anyone to understand how much. They buried their dead there. They had to. In 1888, the cemeteries of Richmond that would take a black body were few and far and expensive. And when Delia Rooks's grandson died of the fever at 4 years old, there was no ground anywhere in this city that would receive him with dignity except the ground behind their own church. So they consecrated the back half of that narrow lot, and they laid the boy down, and over the next 40 years they laid down 61 more. Mothers, 2 Union veterans of the United States colored troops, a midwife who had delivered half of Jackson Ward, They did not always have money for stone, so many of the graves were marked with brick, or with a cross of sycamore, or with nothing at all but the memory of the people who dug them. And that memory was written down, every name, every date, in a leather ledger that Amos Pinner's daughter kept, because Amos had told her something she never forgot. Paper remembers, he said, longer than people do. When they sealed the cornerstone of the chapel in the autumn of 1888, they put things inside it. A Bible, a list of the 14 families, and a copy of that burial ledger and a hand-drawn plat of the lot, showing the chapel on the front and the consecrated ground on the back, with a line of ink dividing the living's business from the dead's. Cornelia Braxton knew all of this because her husband had told her, and her husband had known because his grandmother was the girl who kept the ledger. Josiah Braxton pastored Mount Pisgah for 31 years. He was a tall, slow-moving man with enormous, gentle hands and a voice that could fill the chapel without ever seeming to rise. And he loved 3 things without measure: his God, his wife, and that patch of ground behind his church where his own people slept. In the last year of his life, when the cancer had made him thin and the walks had gotten short, he used to take Cornelia by the arm, out to the back of the lot in the evening, and they would stand there where the sycamore threw its long shadow, and he would tell her the names. He knew them all: Delia, Amos, the boy who died of the fever. Cornelia had come to Mount Pisgah at 19 in the summer of 1969, a girl from Bayou Lafourche with a cardboard suitcase held shut by a belt, and she had come for the singing and stayed for the tall, slow preacher with the gentle hands. Josiah was 12 years older than her, and plainly terrified of her, which she found delightful. He courted her for 2 years on the front steps of that chapel, never once alone with her, without her aunt sitting 3 feet away, and when he finally asked her to marry him, he did it out back, by the sycamore, among the graves, because he said he wanted his people to be there for it, all of them, the ones above the ground and the ones below. She had thought that was a strange place for a proposal. She came to understand it was the truest thing about him. She learned the church the way you learn a body you love, by its sounds and its seasons. She learned the home-going funerals, the way the choir would rise as the casket came down the aisle, and the whole church would follow it out onto the street singing, sorrow going in one door and hope coming out the other, an old upright piano and 60 voices turning grief into a thing a whole neighborhood could carry together. She learned which floorboard sang under the choir's feet and which window let in the 4 o'clock light. And she learned the ledger because old Ione Pinner, Amos's granddaughter, 90 years old and sharp as a fish knife, put the book into Josiah's hands one Sunday and said, "This here is the church's memory, and a church that forgets its dead is just a building with a steeple." Josiah kept it locked in a drawer in the vestry, and he showed his young wife where, and he told her what his own grandmother had told him. Paper remembers longer than people do. He made her promise out there, one evening in October, with a freight train working somewhere down along the river and the smell of somebody's greens and cornbread drifting across the back fences. He took both her hands and he said, "Cornelia, when I'm gone, they are going to come for this ground. Men always come for ground. You keep it whatever it takes, you keep this ground." "I will," she told him. She buried him in the spring, in the back of the lot, the 64th soul to lie in that consecrated earth, and she took his old cardigan out of the closet, and she started wearing it. And she never took off her promise either. Now let me ask you something, because I think it matters. Have you ever made a promise to someone at the edge of a grave? If you have, then you know it is not the kind of promise you break, because a rich man in a good suit tells you the thing is worthless. You know that a promise like that has a weight to it that money simply cannot lift. Warren Kessler did not know that. Warren Kessler had never made a promise in his life that he could not buy his way out of. He came to Jackson Ward the way weather comes. Kessler Vantage Development had spent 2 years quietly assembling a full city block along the river, parcel by parcel, and Warren Kessler intended to raise on it a thing called Shockoe Rise, 3 glass towers, a private marina, 410 luxury residences, a rooftop that would put his name in the sky over the same river his grandfather had unloaded barges on. It was, by his own accounting to his investors, a $380 million development, and it was 90% assembled. The way you assemble a block like that, if you are Warren Kessler, is you do not knock on doors. You go to the courthouse. You pull the tax rolls, and you find the properties where the owners are old, or dead, or scattered across 4 states as heirs who have never spoken to a lawyer. And you find the ones who are a few dollars behind on their taxes. And you buy the tax debt, and then you use the machinery of the law, which was not built for people like Delia Rooks, and was built very well indeed for people like Warren Kessler, and you squeeze. His acquisitions man was named Brant Sable, 35 years old, pale blue shirt always open 1 button too far, a smile like a man who has never once been told no and did not believe the word applied to him. Brant Sable was the one who found Mount Pisgah on the rolls. The church owed $186 in back taxes on the lot, a clerical thing, a lapsed exemption from the years after Josiah died when the congregation had dwindled to 19 souls and Cornelia had been carrying the whole thing on a widow's pension. Brant bought the debt, Brant filed the papers, and Brant discovered to his irritation that the old woman would not simply go away. She came to the hearings, all of them. She sat in the 3rd row in her sparrow-colored sweater with a spiral notebook, and she took down every word, and she said, each time in that quiet, even voice, the same thing. This ground is a burial ground. You cannot build on the dead. And each time, a board judge looked at the survey Kessler's people had submitted, a clean, modern survey that showed a vacant lot and a condemned structure, and not one single grave, because the graves had no stones the county recognized, and the judge said, "Ma'am, there's no cemetery of record here," and moved on. She did not move on. At the 3rd hearing, she stood up, all 5 feet of her, and she asked the judge a question in that quiet, even voice. If a man dies and no one carves him a stone, she said, does that mean he was never alive? The judge told her that was not a legal question. She said, "No, sir, I don't suppose it is." And she sat back down and wrote something in her spiral notebook. 2 seats over, Brant Sable leaned toward the man beside him and said something behind his hand, and they both smiled. Cornelia saw it. She wrote that down too. The graders came for parcel 7 on a Tuesday in the rain. She stood at the chain fence in her cardigan and watched a yellow machine the size of a house scrape the skin off the back of the lot, 40 feet from where the sycamore stood, and she called out to the young man running it, not angry, just clear. "Son, there are people under there." The young man could not hear her over the engine, or chose not to, and the blade came down again, and the dark earth turned over, wet and glistening, and Cornelia Braxton went home and did not sleep that night. Some things you cannot unsee. A machine peeling back the ground over your own husband's grave is one of them. There's no cemetery of record. Hold on to those words. They are going to matter more than anyone in that courtroom understood. That is how it came to the fellowship hall, and the cameras, and the $186. Kessler's lawyers had told him the cleanest thing, optically, was not to bulldoze a widow's church on the evening news. The cleanest thing was to look generous. Give her the condemned chapel back. Let her keep her pile of old brick. He would take the land underneath through a separate action already grinding forward. And she would be left holding a building she could not afford to fix, on a lot that was no longer hers, and in 6 months it would all be quiet. And the towers would go up and no one would remember the name Mount Pisgah at all. That was the plan. It was a good plan. It had exactly one flaw, and the flaw was this. Warren Kessler had spent 2 years and $11 million studying that block, and he had never once opened the cornerstone. There was one other person in that fellowship hall who was not laughing. Her name was Renee Carrington, and she was 29 years old, and she worked in the land records office of the Richmond's Circuit Court clerk, in a basement room that smelled of dust and old toner, filing and pulling the deeds and surveys that men like Brant Sable requested by the dozen. Renee had grown up 6 blocks from Mount Pisgah. Her grandmother had been baptized in it. She had come tonight on her own time, standing in the back by the coffee, and she had watched Warren Kessler hand an old woman a folded deed like he was tipping a valet, and something in her had gone very cold and very still. Because Renee Carrington had processed the Kessler Vantage tax sale filings for 18 months. She had stamped them and filed them and told herself it was just paper, just her job. The law was the law. But she had also noticed things. Small things, the kind of things that live in the margins of documents that a clerk sees and a judge never does. And standing in the back of that hall, watching that old woman fold that deed into a pocket next to a peppermint, Renee Carrington decided she was going to go back down into that basement and pull every single file in the Kessler Vantage assemblage and read them the way nobody had read them yet. She did not know that night what she would find. She only knew she could not keep filing it as if it were nothing. And I will tell you, because I have lived long enough to believe it, the whole world can turn on one ordinary person deciding, quietly, that they are done looking away. Cornelia did not go home from the fellowship hall and weep, though she had earned the right to. She went home to the narrow brick row house on St. James Street that she had shared with Josiah for 41 years. And she made a cup of coffee, and she sat at the kitchen table under the light of a single bulb, and she took down from the top of the refrigerator a dented biscuit tin with a faded picture of a Scottish castle on the lid. Inside it was 40 years of paper, every tax receipt, every letter from the diocese and the city, the exemption approval from 1971, and the notice from 4 years ago saying the exemption had lapsed. Church bulletins. And at the bottom, wrapped in a handkerchief, a photograph of Josiah standing in front of the chapel in 1979, squinting into the sun, his big hands folded in front of him. Paper remembers, she thought, longer than people do. The next morning she called her great-nephew. Theo Braxton was 23, and a first-year law student at Loyola, the first lawyer the family had ever produced, which he was not yet but intended to be. And he drove over from Gentilly in a car that made a sound cars should not make, and sat at his great-aunt's table and listened while she told him everything. About 1888, about the ledger, about the boy who died of the fever, about the promise at the graveside. And then she said the thing that made him put down his coffee. "Baby," she said, "there are 64 people buried behind that church, and that man is about to pour concrete on top of them. And the only proof that they are there is sealed inside a stone that has not been opened since Grover Cleveland was president." Theo Braxton did not know much law yet, but he knew the word evidence, and he knew the word desecration, and he knew the look on his great-aunt's face, and he said, "Then we opened the stone." Here is a thing worth stopping on. In every one of these stories, and I have told a few, there is always a moment where an ordinary person could still walk away, where the smart money says, "Be quiet, take your loss, don't fight a man with 300 lawyers." Cornelia Braxton reached that moment at her own kitchen table, 74 years old, with a widow's pension and a nephew who wasn't a lawyer yet, and a promise she made to a dying man. And she chose the harder thing. Not because she was sure she would win. She had no reason to think she would win. She chose it because some grounds you keep whatever it takes, and this was hers. They opened the cornerstone on a Saturday, Theo and 2 men from the congregation, with a cold chisel and a great deal of care, and the mortar of 1888 gave way in a small cloud of pale dust, and inside the cavity, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff as tin, was a Bible, a list of 14 names, and a leather ledger, and folded inside the ledger, a plat of the lot drawn in brown ink showing the chapel on the front, and the consecrated burial ground on the back, 61 souls recorded by 1928, and a line of ink dividing the living's business from the dead's. And when Theo laid that plat over the modern survey Kessler's engineers had filed with the city, the one that showed a clean, vacant lot, the 2 lines did not match. Not even close. The 1888 burial ground extended 40 feet past the property line the county now recognized, into what the modern survey labeled Parcel 7, staked and graded and ready for the eastern foundation of Tower 1. They had already brought earth movers onto Parcel 7. They had already scraped the topsoil. Warren Kessler's $380 million tower was going to rise directly on top of Delia Rooks's grandson. And the Commonwealth of Virginia, it turned out, had something very specific to say about that. Because here is the part Warren Kessler's $11 million of due diligence never accounted for. In the Commonwealth of Virginia, there is a law called the Virginia Antiquities Act, and it does not care whether a grave has a headstone the county recognizes. It does not care whether there is a cemetery of record. It cares whether human beings are buried in the ground. And when there is credible evidence that they are, all activity stops, by law, and the matter goes to the state, and no one may disturb that ground, by permit or by bulldozer, until the state's Department of Historic Resources has found the dead, and mapped them, and made certain they would be treated with dignity. It is not a zoning matter. It is not a thing you settle with a judge who is bored on a Tuesday. It is the one line in the law that a man like Kessler could not buy, could not lobby, could not survey away. Because it was written for exactly this. For the graves the powerful prefer to forget. Theo filed the ledger and the plat with the Virginia Department of Historic Resources on a Monday morning. By Wednesday, there was a stop work order on Parcel 7. By Friday, the story was no longer about a generous developer giving an old widow her church back. A state archaeologist named Dr. Aurelia Colvin came out to Parcel 7 with ground-penetrating radar and a team of graduate students, and over 4 days they read the earth the way Ione Pinner had read her ledger. And the earth agreed with the ledger down to the foot. 64 anomalies, human-sized, laid in rows, exactly where the 1888 plat had said they would be, reaching 40 feet under the staked foundation of Tower 1. Dr. Colvin came to the fence at the end of the 4th day and said quietly, "Mrs. Braxton, they are all here. Every one of them." And Cornelia Braxton, who had known it for 40 years, who had promised a dying man she would prove it, put her hand over her mouth and wept for the first time in the whole ordeal. Not from grief. From the particular relief of finally being believed. The neighborhood came out to the fence that evening, old people mostly, people whose own homes and graves had been cleared or nearly cleared, and they did not cheer. They stood at the iron rail as the light went gold over the sycamore, and one of them began to hum, low, and then another. And by full dark, there was a whole street humming an old hymn over 64 souls who had, after 130 years, finally been counted. And while the graves were burying the tower, a young woman in a basement was quietly burying the rest. Renee Carrington had spent 3 nights, after hours on her own time, pulling every tax sale filing in the Kessler Vantage assemblage, 31 parcels, and reading the certified mail records for each one. And what she found was the small ugly thing that lives in the margins. The law says that before you take a person's property for back taxes, you must give them real notice reasonably calculated to actually reach them. Because the Constitution does not let the government or its buyers take your home in secret. On more than a third of those parcels, the notices had gone out to addresses that were decades wrong, to heirs long dead, to a demolished building. In the case of Mount Pisgah, the statutory notice had been mailed to the church itself, addressed to a pastor who had been in his grave for 9 years. And when it came back undelivered, no one had lifted a finger to find the actual living owner, who came to every hearing and sat in the 3rd row, and could have been handed the notice by anyone who cared to walk 20 feet. That is not a technicality. That is the difference between a lawful taking and a theft with a county stamp on it. And it meant that a whole spine of Kessler's assemblage rested on tax sales that a court could unwind, that the church still held a right to redeem, that the title he had shown his lenders as clean was, in the language of the trade, clouded, and in plain English, was not entirely his. Renee Carrington made copies. She was risking her job, and she knew it, because her supervisor golfed with Brant Sable, and she made the copies anyway, and she brought them to a lawyer whose name she got from a legal aid clinic, and the lawyer brought in 2 more. And quietly, the way water finds the crack in a foundation, the thing began to move. Renee came to St. James Street one evening to return something she had never taken. She stood on the step with a manila folder held against her chest and told Cornelia who she was, a clerk, nobody, and that her grandmother, Vernell Carrington, had been baptized in Mount Pisgah in 1948. Cornelia looked at her a long moment. "Vernell's grandbaby," she said. "Come in out of the heat." They sat at the kitchen table under the single bulb, and Renee laid out the certified mail cards, the wrong addresses, the notice sent to a man 9 years in his grave. And then she said the thing she had come to say, that she had almost not come, that she could lose her job, that she had stamped these papers herself for a year and a half, and told herself the whole time that it was nothing, just her job, just paper. Cornelia poured her a cup of coffee and set it in front of her. "Baby," she said, "you didn't stamp nothing. You kept it. There's a difference between the ones who file a thing and the ones who keep it. And you just found out tonight which one you are." Renee Carrington cried a little at that table, and Cornelia let her, and did not put any words on top of it, because some things do not need them. There was a 3rd strand, and it was the ugliest, and it did the most damage in the end. When the lawyers started interviewing the other people Kessler Vantage had cleared off that block, a pattern came out of the shadows. An 81-year-old man who had signed away his family's brick row house for $9,000, because two men in suits told him he would owe more than that in fines if he didn't. A pair of sisters in their 70s pressured into a quitclaim over a kitchen table in a single afternoon. The $186 performance in the fellowship hall was not an act of generosity. Placed next to the others, it was one more data point in a documented pattern of targeting elderly black homeowners. And Virginia has a name for that too. And it is elder financial exploitation. And it is not a civil embarrassment. It is a crime, and the Attorney General's office does not golf with Brant Sable now. Let me pull us up out of the weeds of the law for a moment, because I do not want you to miss the human shape of what was happening, which is the only part that ever really matters. For 2 years, Warren Kessler had treated 64 buried human beings and one living widow and a whole neighborhood of old people as line items, as friction, as things to be cleared. He had built an empire on the assumption that the past was silent, that the dead do not testify, that an old woman in a worn cardigan has no power against a man with towers. And every one of those assumptions was about to be answered by paper, by a ledger a freedman's daughter kept because her father told her to, by certified mail cards a clerk refused to ignore, by the receipts an old woman had folded into a biscuit tin for 40 years. The powerful forget on purpose, because forgetting is profitable. But somewhere, someone always keeps the paper. And there is nothing on this earth more dangerous to a liar than an old woman who kept the receipt. The stop work order became an injunction. The injunction became a headline. The construction loan that financed Shako Rise, $380 million of it, carried the ordinary covenants any loan that size carries. Clear and marketable title, all permits valid and in force, no material litigation. Within a month, Kessler had failed all three. A clouded title, a revoked grading permit, a criminal referral, and a stack of civil suits. The lender did what lenders do when the covenants break. It stopped funding. And a development that is 90% assembled and 0% funded is not an empire. It is a hole in the ground and a mountain of debt with your name carved into the side of it. The investors did not call to ask how he was feeling. And so we come back around to where I told you we would. To Warren Kessler, standing at the door of a condemned chapel on St. James Street, in the rain, in a suit that no longer looked like armor, holding a folder he had not been able to make anyone accept. He had come alone. That told you something, that he had come alone. Brant Sable was already gone, already on a plane, already very interested in a job in another state. Kessler stood under the little overhang at the chapel door, where the rain came off the broken gutter in a thin, cold rope. And when Cornelia Braxton opened the door in her sparrow-colored cardigan, his hands were shaking. Not trembling, shaking. "Mrs. Braxton," he said, "whatever it's worth to you, name it. The chapel, the lot, all of it. I'll buy it back at 10 times, 20 times. I'll fund the restoration. I'll put your husband's name on a plaque on the whole development. I don't care. Please." His voice broke on the last word, and it was not a performance this time. There were no cameras. There was only an old woman and a man who had finally met a wall his money could not move. "Please, I'm asking you." Cornelia Braxton looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached over to the little table by the door, and she picked up the biscuit tin with the Scottish castle on the lid, and Warren Kessler flinched, the way a man flinches who has learned to be afraid of paper. But she did not hand him a lawsuit. She opened the lid, and she took out the photograph, the one of Josiah in 1979, squinting into the sun in front of this same door, and she held it up so Kessler could see it. "This ground," she said, "is not for sale. It never was. My husband is in it. Delia Rooks's grandbaby is in it. 2 soldiers of the United States are in it. You walked over them for 2 years, and you never once said good morning." She put the photograph back in the tin gently and closed the lid. "You can go now, Mr. Kessler." The rain's letting up. She did not raise her voice. She did not gloat. She was, if you had looked closely, sad, the particular tired sadness of a person who takes no joy in watching anyone fall, even a man who earned it. And Warren Kessler stood there another moment in the thinning rain, and then he turned and walked back down the wet steps to a car that would soon belong to the bank, and Cornelia Braxton closed the door. The graves beneath it had buried his empire. but she took no pleasure in the burying. That is the difference between them, and I would ask you to remember it, because it is the whole point. Now I could end the story there, and it would be a satisfying enough ending, the proud man humbled, the widow standing at her door. But that is the kind of ending that men like Kessler give the world. All fall and no rising, and Cornelia Braxton believed in something better than that. So, let me tell you what she built out of the wreckage, because that is the part that actually mattered to her. She did not keep the money that eventually came. There was money, in the end, a settlement from what remained of Kessler's holdings, a fund the court directed toward the harm that had been done. She could have put it in the bank and lived soft for the rest of her days, and no soul alive would have blamed her. She did not. She used it to consecrate the ground, properly this time, with the state's own archaeologists mapping every one of the 64 graves so that no one could ever again claim there was no cemetery of record. She had a low iron fence put around the burial ground and a single granite stone raised at the head of it, and on the stone were carved all 64 names, the ones the ledger had kept, Delia and Amos and the 2 soldiers and the boy who died of the fever, and beneath the names one line. They kept the paper, so we would keep the promise. She used the rest to start a thing she called the Pinnerooks Land Trust, named for the freedmen and the washerwoman who bought the lot in 1888, and its purpose was simple and exact: to help the old people of Jackson Ward, the ones Kessler's kind came for, to hold on to their ground, to pay a lapsed tax bill before it became a tax sale, to untangle an heir's property title before a Brant Sable could pry it apart, to make sure that no other widow ever had to open a cornerstone, to prove her own people were real. She made Renee Carrington its first director. Renee, who had risked her small good job in a basement because she could not keep filing a theft as if it were nothing. Left the clerk's office and spent the rest of her career making sure the paper worked for the people it had always been used against. And Theo Braxton, who finished law school 2 years later, did his first pro bono work for the trust, and his second, and never really stopped, and became in time exactly the kind of lawyer his family had waited 3 generations to produce. Mount Pisgah opened its doors again. Not as a grand thing. 19 souls became 40, and 40 became enough, and on Sunday mornings you could hear the singing from the sidewalk on St. James Street, and behind the chapel the sycamore still threw its long shadow over the iron fence and the granite stone. And Cornelia Braxton, until she was very old, would walk out there in the evenings in her husband's worn cardigan and stand where he used to stand and say the names. So let me leave you with what this story left me with, and then I will let you go. We tell ourselves that the powerful win because they are strong, and the powerless lose because they are weak. And the world runs on money and always will. And a great deal of the time it looks exactly like that. A rich man in a good suit hands an old woman a building he calls garbage, and the room laughs, and you would bet every dollar you have on the rich man. But underneath his feet the whole time, in ground he never bothered to look at, was the truth. And the truth had been written down and kept, patiently, for 130 years, by people who had nothing but their word and their paper, and their refusal to be forgotten. He had money, she had the receipt, and in the end the receipt was heavier. Warren Kessler thought he was burying a church. He was standing on the thing that would bury him, and he was too proud to look down. So here is my question for you, and I mean it. So sit with it a second before you scroll on. Have you ever watched someone in power decide who mattered and who didn't, who was real and who could be cleared away, and stayed quiet, because it wasn't your fight, and they had all the power? Or have you, at some point in your life, been the one they decided didn't count, the one they laughed at, the one they handed the garbage and expected to say thank you and go away? Tell me down in the comments. Somebody reading tonight needs to hear that quiet is not the same as beaten, that patience is not the same as surrender, and that the dead and the widows and the clerks in the basement keep better records than the powerful ever imagine. If this story moved you, do an old storyteller a kindness. Tap the like so more people find it. Subscribe and ring the bell so the next one comes to you. And share it with somebody who needs reminding tonight that some ground you keep, whatever it takes. Delia Rooks kept the paper. Cornelia Braxton kept the promise. Now you keep the story.